At a few minutes past noon on March 6, 1945, a 21-year-old corporal from Allentown, Pennsylvania sat in the gunner's seat of an American tank and looked through his periscope at the ruins of one of the oldest cities in Germany. Cologne's twin-spired cathedral was still standing ahead of him, one of the only structures in the entire city center that was. Everything else was rubble. Block after block of medieval stone and modern apartment buildings had been flattened by 2 years of Allied bombing raids. More than 14 direct hits had struck the cathedral itself, and somehow it held. Around it, the city looked like the surface of the moon. Clarence Smoyer had been in tanks since Normandy. He had seen men burn. He had watched the lead tank in a column take a round and learned, the way every tanker in the Western theater eventually learned, to feel something go quiet inside when it happened and keep moving. He was not an aggressive man by nature. Fellow crew members would later describe him as gentle, a man who had volunteered for the paratroopers when he was first drafted precisely because he thought fighting with an elite force would get him home in fewer pieces, until the Army looked at his test scores and assigned him to tanks instead. But inside that gunner's seat, running the calculation between his reticle and a target, Smoyer was something else. He was, his commanders had concluded, among the best tank gunners in the 3rd Armored Division. And the 3rd Armored, which had been fighting its way across Europe since the hedgerows of Normandy, had a fairly exacting standard of comparison. The tank he was sitting in that morning was not the tank he had come to Europe with. That tank was a Sherman, and a Sherman, by 1945, had a particular reputation among the men who rode inside them. The 3rd Armored Division had entered combat in Normandy in July of 1944 with 232 M4 Shermans. By the end of the European campaign, the division's record showed 648 of those tanks completely destroyed in combat and another 700 knocked out, repaired, and returned to the line. That was a loss rate of 580% against the original complement, a number that says something stark about what it had been like to be an American tanker in the fighting from France to the German border. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. The Sherman had not started the war as a bad tank. When it was designed in 1941 and rolled into North Africa in 1942, it was a reasonable match for what the Germans were fielding. It was fast. It was mechanically reliable in a way that some of its German counterparts were not. It could be built by the tens of thousands on American assembly lines and shipped across an ocean without shaking apart. These were not small virtues in a global war fought across 5 continents. But the war the Sherman had been designed for was not quite the war that turned up. By 1943, the Germans had introduced 2 new tanks that changed the arithmetic of armored combat on every front they appeared on. The Panther weighed 47 tons. Its sloped frontal armor was designed around the hard lessons the German army had absorbed facing Soviet T-34s on the Eastern Front, and the 75mm high-velocity gun it carried could reach out and destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's own gun was nearly useless in return. The Tiger was worse. 57 tons of steel, the 88mm cannon that had begun its career as an anti-aircraft weapon and turned out to be one of the most lethal tank guns of the war, and frontal armor that the Sherman's 75mm gun could not penetrate at any combat range. Not from 500 yards. Not from 200 yards. The American Army's own after-action reports from the summer of 1944 had stated this flatly. The 75mm gun on the standard M4 was inadequate for frontal engagement against either the Panther or the Tiger. The only way to kill them was to get around to the flank or the rear, which required one platoon to absorb the enemy's fire while another maneuvered, a tactical approach that worked well on paper and cost men their lives in the bocage of Normandy and the mud of the Hurricane Forest. American tank crews knew this before the ordnance reports confirmed it. They had been telling their officers about it since Tunisia. The response from the upper reaches of the Army was, for a period of time, a study in institutional resistance that would later become one of the more uncomfortable stories in the history of American armor. The push to build a better American tank had been going on since the summer of 1942. A team within the Army Ordnance Department had been working on a new medium tank design almost from the moment the Sherman entered production. the theory being that an army should always be developing the next vehicle while the current one is fighting. The prototype design that would eventually become the Pershing began to take recognizable shape by 1943, designated the T-26, carrying a 90mm gun derived from an anti-aircraft weapon and frontal armor 4 inches thick at the glacis plate, enough to stop the guns that were killing Shermans at Normandy. The weight penalty was severe. The T-26 came in at over 40 tons, which pushed it from the Army's medium tank category into heavy territory. But the gun was the thing. The 90mm could do to German armor what German armor had been doing to Shermans for 2 years. The design was ready. The engineering problems were largely solved. And then it sat. The resistance came from several directions at once. But the most consequential figure in the story was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the commander of Army Ground Forces and the man most responsible for organizing, training, and equipping the American ground forces that would fight across France and into Germany. McNair was by every account a serious, methodical officer, the man who had helped build the training infrastructure that turned millions of American civilians into soldiers in under 2 years. He was not a fool, but he had fathered a doctrine, and the doctrine had acquired the weight of institutional faith. The tank destroyer doctrine, as it was formally known, held that tanks should not fight other tanks. Tanks were for exploitation, for punching through a breached line and running deep into the enemy's rear, not for grinding through frontal engagements against enemy armor. Dedicated tank destroyer vehicles, fast, lightly armored, carrying powerful guns, were supposed to handle enemy tanks. The system had a certain elegance to it on paper, and in the fluid warfare McNair imagined, it might have functioned as intended. In the hedgerow country of Normandy and the fortified approaches to the German border, it frequently did not. McNair's logic flowed naturally from his doctrine. If tanks were not going to fight tanks, there was no need for a heavier tank with a 90mm gun. The M4 with a 76mm upgrade would be sufficient. The supply chain from the American coast to the European theater was already stretched across 3,000 miles of ocean. Introducing a new heavy tank would complicate spare parts, maintenance, transportation, all of it. And for what advantage, exactly, if the tank destroyer battalions were handling the enemy armor anyway? McNair was not alone in this view. The commanders of the only 2 American armored divisions that had seen combat by late 1943 could not reach consensus on whether a new heavy tank was even needed. Some senior armor officers had developed an attachment to the Sherman's virtues that made them skeptical of anything that traded mobility for firepower. Among those identified by historians as broadly resistant to the new design's urgency was George Patton, the Army's most prominent armor advocate, who had come to trust the Sherman's speed and reliability and was wary of a heavier vehicle whose performance in combat remained untested. The men pushing hardest for the T-26 were overruled, bypassed, and argued to a standstill. General Jacob Devers, commanding American forces in the Mediterranean theater, had seen enough of what happened when American Shermans met German Panthers to feel urgency about the question. In the fall of 1943, Devers pressed hard for immediate production of 250 T-26s. McNair blocked it. Devers went over McNair's head to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, who in December of 1943 authorized production of 250 of the new tanks. The order should have ended the argument. It did not. Production, ordered in January of 1944, did not actually begin until November of that year. The most critical window had been missed. The Pershing would not land in Normandy. It would not be there for the breakout across France. It would not be there for the Battle of the Bulge, when German Tiger and Panther tanks came down through the Ardennes and American tankers went to meet them in the same Shermans they had been riding since North Africa. In those winter battles, crews had begun wrapping spare tracks around the fronts of their tanks as improvisational armor, a testament to the gap between what the ordnance chart said and what happened when a Panther round arrived through the hull at 200 yards. In November of 1944, as the first batch of T-26 E-3s came off the line at the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, the 3rd Armored Division was fighting through the Hurricane Forest, one of the most costly engagements the division had endured. By the time those tanks were loaded onto ships in American harbors, sailed across the Atlantic, and offloaded at Antwerp, Belgium, the bulge had already happened. American tankers had already fought and bled and died in what they knew were inferior vehicles, not because the Army lacked the engineering capacity to build a better one, but because the institutional machinery that decides which tanks and Army fields had spent 2 years arguing about whether it was necessary. 20 T-26 E-3s arrived in Europe in January of 1945 as part of what the Army called the Zebra Mission, a field evaluation program overseen personally by Major General Gladion Barnes, chief of the Ordnance Department's Research and Development Section. The name suggested something provisional, almost experimental, as if the question of whether a 90mm gun was a good idea was still being answered. Barnes had brought with him engineers from the tank's manufacturer and ordnance specialists to handle the teething problems that any new vehicle entering combat carried. The tanks were divided between the 3rd Armored and 9th Armored Divisions, 10 each. The 3rd Armored allocated its 10 tanks across its armored regiments, 1 per company, the idea being to put the best crews available in the new machines. Clarence Smoyer and his crew, Commander Sergeant Bob Early, Loader John DeRiggy, Driver William McVeigh, and Bow Gunner Homer Davis, were chosen for one of them. The tank they received was T-26 E-3, and they called it Eagle 7. The T-26 E-3 weighed 46 tons, nearly 11 tons more than a standard Sherman. Its 90mm main gun was based on the same anti-aircraft weapon the Germans had turned against Allied armor with devastating effect, now turned the other way. The frontal armor at the hull glacis was 4 inches thick, enough for the first time in the American armored force to have a reasonable conversation about what a Tiger or Panther round might do when it arrived from the front at combat range. The transmission was different enough from the Shermans that crews needed specific training before operating it reliably, and the Zebra Mission engineers spent several days running the new crews through its peculiarities before anyone took them near the front. What struck the tankers most, the accounts suggest, was not the armor. It was the gun. After fighting in a vehicle whose main armament bounced off the frontal plate of a Panther at close range, the knowledge that they were now carrying a weapon that could reach a Tiger at 900 yards and put a round through its gun shield was something the veterans of the 3rd Armored received as a kind of belated justice. The first test came quickly. On the night of February 25, 1945, a T-26 E-3 named Fireball from the 3rd Armored's Company F, 33rd Armored Regiment, was overwatching a roadblock near the village of Elsdorf in the Rhineland when a concealed Tiger from the German Heavy Panzer Battalion 301 opened fire from about 100 yards, silhouetted against a nearby fire. The Pershing was an easy target at that range. The Tiger's first round penetrated the turret through the machine gun port in the mantlet and killed both the gunner and the loader inside. A second shot hit the gun barrel. A third destroyed the commander's cupola. Fireball was knocked out before the crew could fire back. It was the first T-26 E-3 lost in combat, and it demonstrated with uncomfortable precision that the new tank was not invulnerable, that a Tiger at close range with the advantage of concealment and surprise could still do what Tigers had always done to American tanks. The following day produced a different result. Sergeant Nicholas Mashlonick, commanding T-26 E-3 No. 40 from the same regiment, spotted an entrenched Tiger operating near Elsdorf as the American advance continued. The Tiger had dug its vehicle into position to reduce its exposed profile. Mashlonick had his driver inch the Pershing forward slowly until just enough of the turret was exposed for a shot, then took the gunner's controls himself. He fired a high-velocity, armor-piercing round from 900 yards. The round penetrated. A second shot followed. The Tiger burned. In the hours that followed, the same Pershing destroyed 2 Panzer IV tanks at 1,200 yards. When Major General Maurice Rose, commanding the 3rd Armored, arrived to inspect the results, he sent a message to General Eisenhower that the Army needed to rush more of the new tanks to Europe immediately. For his part, Smoyer, who was not yet in his first engagement in the Pershing but had heard what the 90mm was doing at Elsdorf, told his fellow tankers plainly that the Army needed a whole bunch more of these sent over. The 3rd Armored continued its push eastward through the late February mud toward the Rhine. By the night of March 3rd to 4th, the division's vanguard had reached the riverbank at Werringen, directly north of Cologne. The city lay just to the south, 2,000 years old, Germany's fourth largest before the war, its cathedral still standing over a landscape that bore almost no other resemblance to the city that had existed for years earlier. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces had visited Cologne more than 260 times. More than 20,000 tons of bombs had fallen on it. The cathedral had taken 14 direct hits and survived. The city around it had not. What the 3rd Armored was driving toward on March 5th was not a city so much as an enormous field of rubble with a Gothic church rising out of the center of it. The German forces defending Cologne had no realistic hope of holding the city. Elements of the 9th Panzer Division, 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, 363rd Volksgrenadier Division, and various Volkssturm units. The militia formations Germany had begun conscripting from its remaining male population regardless of age or fitness as the end approached, held a contracting perimeter that could not withstand the weight being brought against it. The Hohenzollern railway bridge across the Rhine had been blown prematurely by the retreating Germans, cutting off any organized withdrawal of the defenders on the western bank. The soldiers who remained were fighting with their backs to a river and a destroyed bridge. Among them, somewhere in the ruined streets near the train station adjacent to the cathedral, was a single Panther tank commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth, whose crew had prepared an ambush position and intended to use it. The Panther was a different animal from the Tiger. Where the Tiger was blocky, almost deliberately brutal in its mass, the Panther had sloped armor derived from the same studies of Soviet tank construction that had produced the T-34, and its 75mm high-velocity gun was long-barreled enough that at many combat ranges it was the more lethal opponent in a duel. Against the Sherman, its advantages had been so pronounced that American crews had developed a categorical fear of it that shaped their tactical thinking in every engagement. Against the Pershing, the mathematics were different, though the crews on both sides had not yet had enough encounters to know exactly how different. On the morning of March 6th, the 3rd Armored pushed into the heart of Cologne from the northwest, while infantry units cleared resistance, building by building, through the rubble. Smoyer and Eagle 7 were advancing with easy company when their column was stalled by a confrontation at an intersection several blocks from the cathedral. A German Panzer IV and a short, brutal exchange in which a civilian car was caught in the crossfire. A young German girl named Katharina Esser was struck in that exchange and died of her wounds shortly afterward. The incident was photographed by a Signal Corps cameraman. Smoyer carried the memory of it for the rest of his life. While Eagle 7 was stalled, the main effort fell to Fox Company's column moving toward the cathedral on a parallel street, the Komödienstrasse, running east to west directly between the cathedral square and the train station beside it. Leading the Fox Company column was 2nd Lieutenant Karl Kellner, 26 years old, from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, who had been wounded twice and awarded the Silver Star for his actions in Normandy. He was experienced enough to know what a stalled column in a narrow street signified. What Kellner did not know as he moved down the Komödienstrasse was that Wilhelm Bartelborth's Panther was waiting at the far end of it, near the train station, with a clear field of fire down the road. The street was narrow, canal-eyes between bombed buildings, exactly the kind of approach the Panther had been placed to dominate. A pile of rubble blocked the street short of the cathedral square. Kellner's Shermans slowed to assess it, looking for a way through or around. They were still working out the problem when Bartelborth fired. 2 75mm rounds struck the turret of Kellner's lead Sherman in quick succession. 3 of its 5 crew were killed immediately. Kellner himself lost his left leg to the burst and rolled off the back of the burning tank. A 3rd Panther round caught the 2nd Sherman in the tracks as it tried to reverse, stopping it in place. A journalist ran to Kellner where he had fallen. A medic followed. Kellner died 2 hours later in a shell crater, 26 years old. Of his 5-man crew, only the loader and bow gunner survived. The Panther crept forward from its ambush position. Its gun was still oriented down the Komödienstrasse. 2 Shermans burning. The road to the cathedral square closed. The German crew settled in to wait for whatever came next. Down the street to the north, 1 block away and a quarter-mile behind the burning Shermans, Bob Early and Eagle 7 heard the radio traffic, but could not piece together a clear picture of what had happened. It was Jim Bates, a cameraman now attached to the 165th Photo Signal Company, who climbed up on the turret and told him directly, "A Panther, Cathedral Square." Bates had been following the column all morning with his camera rolling, looking for the story of the fall of Cologne. He had just found it. Early did something that the accounts describe as characteristically cool and characteristically dangerous. He got out of his tank. He and Bates walked down the block together until they could duck into the German Labor Front building, a substantial structure with upper-floor windows looking south down the Marseillenstrasse into the Cathedral Square. From there, they could see the Panther. It had moved forward from its original position near the train station and was now oriented roughly down the street, where Kellner's Shermans were still burning. Its gun barrel was not yet pointing toward them. Ole saw the angle. He made his calculation. Then he went back to his tank. The Panther had a 75mm high-velocity gun and frontal armor that no Sherman in the 3rd Armored could reliably penetrate at any combat range. Eagle 7 had a 90mm gun and 4 inches of frontal armor. Neither crew had yet encountered the other. Bartleborth's crew had been fighting the entire Western campaign against Shermans, and a Sherman was the vehicle they were expecting when they heard the sound of tracks from the north. What Bartleborth could not know, because no German crew on the Western Front had yet had a combat encounter with a T-26E3, was that the vehicle about to round the corner was not a Sherman. Eagle 7 moved out from under the shadow of the Commerzbank building and turned into the Marseillenstrasse. Driver William McVeigh had the tank rolling, not creeping. Early had decided that a moving target was harder to kill than a stationary one, and that hesitating at the corner was the same as dying at it. The intersection ahead opened onto the Cathedral Square, and somewhere in that square the Panther was waiting. Early's reconnaissance walk had bought him a sight picture of where it sat. What it had not given him was a guarantee of where it would be pointing when Eagle 7 rounded the corner. Up in the German Labor Front building, Jim Bates had his camera rolling. He had watched Early walk back to the tank. He had watched the tank move. Now it was coming around the corner beneath his window, and through his viewfinder, he could see the Panther across the square. He could also see the Panther's gun barrel beginning to traverse. Bartleborth's sixth sense had fired. He had heard the tracks. He had seen something move at the edge of the intersection. He had turned his gun toward it, and he was looking at a silhouette that was not the silhouette he had been expecting for the past 3 years of fighting the Western Allies. The vehicle was too wide. The turret was the wrong shape. The gun barrel was longer than anything he had ever faced from the Americans. In the accounts gathered after the war, including testimony passed on by his family, Bartleborth apparently told his gunner to hold fire. The tank in his sights did not look like an American tank. It looked, in the confusion of a ruined city, like it might be German. That hesitation lasted seconds. Clarence Smoyer did not hesitate at all. As Eagle 7 cleared the corner and McVeigh continued forward, Smoyer had the Panther in his sight. He did not yet have the perfect angle. Early had scouted a flank shot, but by the time they turned the corner, the Panther had pivoted enough that the broadside Early had planned for was gone. Smoyer was looking at the Panther's right front quarter. The gun barrel was moving toward him. He made the only calculation available to him. He pulled the trigger. The 90mm round left the barrel of Eagle 7 at roughly 1,000 meters per second and struck the Panther below the gun shield. Sparks flew from the impact point. Bartleborth's gunner had his finger on the trigger, but the first hit had already done damage inside the Panther's hull. Smoyer kept calling for armor-piercing rounds, and Loader John DeRiggy kept slamming them in. A second shot. A third. The second and third rounds penetrated the Panther's armor on both sides, in, through, and out, and the Panther caught fire. The fire burned through the night and into the following morning. In his own words, recorded in interviews decades later, Smoyer described looking into his periscope at the moment Eagle 7 cleared the corner and seeing the Panther's gun muzzle pointed straight at him. Not the flank shot Early had scouted, but the barrel of the 75mm pointing at his face. His phrasing was simple and direct. He said he snapped off a quick shot and hit them first. Sitting with that sentence for a moment, It is worth noting what it contains. Not triumph, not the language of score settling. Though Smoyer had watched friends burn in Shermans for the better part of a year and understood exactly what the tank across that square had been doing to American crews since Normandy. Just a factual account of a man in a gunner's seat doing the thing he had been trained to do faster and more accurately than a man across the intersection. That was the entirety of it, in Smoyer's telling. He was always like that about it. Bartleborth survived the fight. 4 of the Panther's 5 crew members managed to escape the burning vehicle. 1 died at the scene. Bartleborth himself was captured by the Americans in Cologne in the days that followed and spent time as a prisoner of war. He would live to be 93 years old, dying in 1998. The reunion between him and Clarence Smoyer never happened. Not because either man refused it, but because the chain of inquiry that would have connected them was not completed until after Bartleborth was already gone. Jim Bates, up in the Labor Front building, had filmed all of it. The footage showed Eagle 7 emerging from shadow into the intersection, the Panther across the square, the muzzle flash of Smoyer's first shot, the impact, the fire. It was, as far as the historical record shows, the first tank duel ever captured on film. When Bates's footage was processed and released, it ran in newsreels across the United States and in theaters around the world. It played in a movie house in Pennsylvania, and in that theater one evening, a young woman watching the newsreel suddenly recognized a face in the footage. A tanker standing on the hull of a Pershing in the aftermath, curly hair visible under his cap. She yelled out the family nickname. She convinced the theater managers to replay the reel so that Smoyer's parents, who had never been to a movie theater, could come and see for themselves that their son was still alive. By that point, Smoyer had been recommended for a Bronze Star for his actions in Cologne, including the Panther and at least 1 other tank engagement in the same day's fighting. His lieutenant had told him the award was coming. Then, a few days after the battle, Smoyer was standing in the rubble of the city when a group of German children gathered around him and began asking for gum. He turned his pockets inside out to show them he had nothing. A military policeman drove up, observed the interaction, and charged Smoyer with fraternization with the enemy. The write-up resulted in a meeting with his captain, a threat of kitchen police duty, and, in the way these things sometimes worked in the machinery of the wartime army, the quiet disappearance of the Bronze Star recommendation somewhere in the administrative chain. Smoyer spent the next 74 years believing that his defiant response to the kitchen police threat was what had cost him the medal. The actual citation had been processed, flagged, and lost in the bureaucratic current that flows underneath every army and every war, carrying the paperwork of men who did things in the field that no one had time to properly document while the front was still moving. Author Adam Makos, who wrote the book-length account of Smoyer's war in a 2019 volume titled Spearhead, spent years untangling the chain. In September of 2019, Smoyer, by then 96 years old, was brought to Washington under the pretext of signing copies of the book at the Pentagon. He found a full Army color guard waiting instead. The Bronze Star was pinned to his chest 74 years after the fight in the Cathedral Square. The ceremony was genuine and the recognition was overdue, but the deeper irony of the occasion was not the delay. The deeper irony was that the tank Smoyer had been riding when he earned the medal had itself been delayed by 2 years of institutional argument, from arriving in time to save the men who came before him. The story behind it lived in the paperwork and the casualty figures and the quiet life of a man from Pennsylvania who went back to the cathedral 68 years later and put flowers on a young woman's grave. Smoyer was awarded his Bronze Star in September of 2019 at the World War II Memorial in Washington, in front of a color guard and a crowd that included his family and the author who had spent years working to arrange it. He was asked about firing 3 rounds at the Panther when one might have been sufficient to stop the threat. His answer was direct. Any crewman still alive in a tank with that powerful a gun pointed at Eagle 7 could have pulled the trigger and killed everyone inside it. He fired until the tank was burning because he and his crew were the ones who had to live or die with the result of that decision, not the people asking the question afterward. That directness, that refusal to perform either regret or pride over what he had done, was consistent in every account of Smoyer across the decades. He had been a young man, given a weapon that worked. At the end of a war in which too many young men before him had been given weapons that did not work well enough, and he had used it with a precision that a Signal Corps cameraman happened to capture on film and movie theater audiences in Pennsylvania happened to watch on a screen. The war ended 2 months later. He went home. The weapon that had been delayed and finally tested in the last months of the fighting went on to the next war, where it killed Soviet-built tanks in Korea with the same 90mm gun that had stopped the Panther in the cathedral square. The men who had blocked and delayed the production of that gun appear not in the newsreel footage, but in the memos. The argument they lost is inscribed in the casualty records of the 3rd Armored Division and in the operational histories of every American armored unit that fought from Normandy to the Rhine and Shermans. The argument's resolution is inscribed in a 40-second film clip of a Panther burning beside the oldest cathedral in Germany, shot by a cameraman from Colorado Springs who was in the right building at the right moment on the only afternoon in the whole war when the Americans brought a tank to Cologne that the Germans had never seen before and did not know how to classify. The Panther's gun was traversing when Smoyer fired. It had almost gotten there. In a different sequence of seconds, Bartleborth would have recognized the Pershing sooner, his gunner would have fired first, and Jim Bates would have filmed something else. That is the razor's edge on which the duel sits, and it is also the razor's edge on which the entire argument about the tank had always sat. The margin between sufficient and not sufficient, between the weapon already in the field and the weapon that could do the job. That margin was measured not in doctrinal papers, but in the seconds between one man's trigger and another man's hesitation on a street in Cologne in the last winter of the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.